Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, June 29, 2023. The Supreme Court says that colleges and universities cannot consider race in student admissions, ruling 6-3 that the admissions programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina that used race as one factor among many violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Coming up, reaction from the leader of the group Students for Fair Admissions, Edward Blum, who brought the case, and he's applauding the decision, and President Joe Biden, who says he strongly disagrees, and quote, the court once again walked away from decades of precedent. President Biden also proposing a new standard where colleges take into account the adversity a student has overcome when selecting among qualified applicants, including racial discrimination. We'll also talk about this decision and the political ramifications with Washington Times politics editor Stephen Dinan. Stephen Dinan will also weigh in on a second Supreme Court decision today, unanimous victory for a U.S. Postal Service worker who is a Christian and requested to not work on Sundays. Also today, the Commerce Department says U.S. economic growth in the first quarter was 2% annualized, stronger than expected. We'll hear from the CEO of Bank of America, Brian Moynihan, on the chances of a recession. Republican presidential candidate Mike Pence makes an unannounced trip to Ukraine to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky and see firsthand the devastation of Russia's invasion. And Assistant U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Dr. Rachel Levine, who is transgender, talks about state laws that prohibit or limit certain care for transgender children. From CNN, the Supreme Court says colleges and universities can no longer take race into consideration as a specific basis for granting admission, a landmark decision overturning long-standing precedent that has benefited Black and Latino students in higher education. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion for the conservative majority, saying the Harvard and University of North Carolina admissions programs violated the Equal Protection Clause because they failed to offer measurable objectives to justify the use of race. He said the programs involve racial stereotyping and had no specific endpoint. That from CNN. Edward Blum is founder and president of the group Students for Fair Admissions, which brought the case. He led a news conference today at the National Press Club in Washington.
The opinion issued today by the United States Supreme Court marks the beginning of the restoration of the colorblind legal covenant that binds together our multiracial, multi-ethnic nation. The polarizing, stigmatizing, and unfair jurisprudence that allowed colleges and universities to use a student's race and ethnicity as a factor to either admit them or reject them has been overruled. These discriminatory admissions practices undermined the integrity of our civil rights laws. Ending racial preferences in college admissions is an outcome that the vast majority of all Americans of all races will celebrate. A university doesn't have real diversity when it simply assembles students who look different but come from similar backgrounds and talk and act and think alike. Moreover, these opinions reestablish the founding principles of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which clearly forbids treating Americans differently by race. Let me quote, at the signing ceremony of the act on July the 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson made these remarks, quoting now, "The purpose of the law is simple. It does not restrict the freedom of any American as long as he respects the rights of others. It does not give special treatment to any citizen." I'm going to read that again. It does not give special treatment to any citizen. It does say the only limit to a man's hope for happiness and for the future of his children shall be his own ability. Beginning today, America's colleges and universities have a legal and moral obligation to strictly abide by the Supreme Court's opinion. These obligations compel the removal of all racial and ethnic classification boxes from undergraduate and postgraduate application forms. Furthermore, the administrators of higher education must note, the law will not tolerate direct proxies for racial classifications. For those in leadership positions at public and private universities, you have an obligation to follow the letter and the spirit of the law.
Edward Blum is founder and president of Students for Fair Admissions at a news conference today in Washington. And the cases decided today by the Supreme Court, Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard and UNC. More from the CNN article on the decision. Justice Clarence Thomas and the court's other four conservatives joined Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, but Justice Thomas, who in 1991 became the second black person to ascend to the nation's highest court, issued a lengthy concurrence that attacked such admissions programs and tore into arguments posited by liberal Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman to join the court, who penned her own fiery dissent in the case. That was from CNN. And here's part of what the two wrote. Justice Thomas, writing, "The court today makes clear that in the future, universities wishing to discriminate based on race in admissions must articulate and justify a compelling and measurable state interest based on concrete evidence. Given the strictures set out by the court, I highly doubt any will be able to do so." And Justice Jackson, writing, "The best that can be said of the majority's perspective is that it proceeds ostrich-like from the hope that preventing consideration of race will end racism. But if that is motivation, the majority proceeds in vain." At the White House today, President Biden criticizing the decisions.
For 45 years, the United States Supreme Court has recognized the college's freedom to decide how to build diverse student bodies and to meet their responsibility of opening doors of opportunity for every single American. In case after case, including recently, just as a few years ago in 2016, the court has affirmed and reaffirmed this view, that colleges could use race not as a determinative factor for admission, but as one of the factors among many in deciding who to admit from a already qualified pool of applicants. Today, the court once again walked away from decades of precedent and as the dissent has made clear. The dissent states in today's decision, quote, rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress, end of quote. I agree with that statement from the dissent. The court has effectively ended affirmative action in college admissions, and I strongly disagree with the court's decision.
President Biden at the White House, he went on to say that he is directing the Department of Education to develop a list of best admissions practices to help colleges and universities keep their commitment to diversify and comply with the Supreme Court ruling.
They should not abandon, let me say this again, they should not abandon their commitment to ensure student bodies of diverse backgrounds and experience that reflect all of America. What I propose for consideration is a new standard, where colleges take into account the adversity a student has overcome when selecting among qualified applicants. Let's be clear, under this new standard, just as was true under the earlier standard, students first have to be qualified applicants. They need the GPA and test scores to meet the school's standards. Once that test is met, then adversity should be considered, including a student's lack of financial means, because we know too few students of low-income families, whether in big cities or rural communities, are getting an opportunity to go to college. When a poor kid, maybe the first in their family to go to college, gets the same grades and test scores as a wealthy kid, whose whole family's gone to the most elite colleges in the country and whose path has been a lot easier. Well, the kid who faced tougher challenges has demonstrated more grit, more determination, and that should be a factor that colleges should take into account in admissions, and many still do. It also means examining where the student grew up and went to high school. It means understanding the particular hardships that each individual student has faced in life, including racial discrimination that individuals have faced in their own lives. The court says, quote, nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an application's discussion of how race has affected his or her life, but be it through discrimination or inspiration or otherwise, end of quote. Because the truth is, we all know it, discrimination still exists in America.
President Biden at the White House. As he finished up, a reporter asked a question about faith in the Supreme Court.
President Biden, the Congressional Black Caucus said the Supreme Court has thrown into question its own legitimacy. Is this a rogue court?
This is not a normal court.
Should there be term limits for the justices, sir?
President Biden at the White House. Stephen Dinan, Washington Times politics editor, has been taking a closer look at today's Supreme Court decision striking down the use of race in college and university admissions. Joining us now on the phone, thanks for being on Washington Today. You've read the majority and dissenting opinions. What do they say, and how strong of language is being used?
So the majority opinion says, as you captured it, says that the use of race preferences, in particular the plans or policies that UNC, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Harvard University used, violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Essentially, they are too imbued with race. And in the words of Chief Justice John Roberts, they're an attempt at racial balancing, of trying to get a particular level of black student population and Hispanic student population, and what he called racial balancing. And he said that treats the people as not as individual candidates, but rather as representatives of races and ethnicities. And he said that violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. The dissents, the three justices dissented. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, writing the chief dissent, went through a lengthy discussion of the history of how we got to this point, and said that the 14th Amendment, as she reads it, isn't about color blindness, which is sort of the key point of the majority. Is the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, requires us not to take race into consideration for these sorts of decisions. She said no, the 14th Amendment actually is an outcome-based amendment. The goal is to achieve a sort of equality, and sometimes you have to use race-conscious programs in order to achieve that equality. And so, if I had to sum up, it's really today's ruling is really a battle over that meaning of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and whether it is meant to be a process that you can't look at race. Basically, the old adage, if you want to stop discriminating, or whether there's some goal to be achieved, and discrimination or race awareness is important on the way to that goal.
President Biden immediately gave a statement at the White House strongly disagreeing with the decision. A lot of members of Congress have been tweeting about it, presidential candidates reacting. What's the political fallout of this decision?
So it'll be interesting to see. Polls generally seem to indicate that Americans are not are less comfortable with affirmative action policies, race-based affirmative action policies, than maybe the elites in politicians are. We'll have to see exactly. There's everything that this current Supreme Court does also comes with its own issues, I guess. Just there's an attitude or an opinion about this particular court right now that may also affect and possibly hurt the gravitas of a ruling of this court. So we'll have to see. It'll be interesting to watch what happens there. We'll also be watching, and I think this may be even more interesting, is watching the how schools grapple with it. There's already a search for, schools are very intent on trying to promote African American and Hispanic student participation, and the schools are already searching for whether there's any leeway in these decisions or this decision about to allow them to try and continue to bolster participation admissions from those particular demographics. And there, some ideas have already popped up. And you mentioned President Biden, and he's, for example, told schools, hey, go ahead and look at ways that you might be able to focus on recruiting based on income or socioeconomic status that might be able to help you get towards, might be able to help you keep black admission rates high, even if you can't look explicitly at race. The Supreme Court also said that while you can't judge somebody specifically based on race can't be a factor. The hurdles that someone may have faced or discrimination someone may have faced because of their race, that can be a factor that can be looked at. So the schools are right now on the search to try to find out what sort of wiggle room there is inside of this ruling. And one other thing that I've seen pop up today is folks on both sides of the affirmative action debate say, hey, the one thing that schools should be can do pretty easily is get rid of alumni preferences and donor preferences, which by and large benefit white students. So if you get rid of those, that goes somewhat towards lower or leveling the playing field. It'll be interesting to see how eager schools are to get to do away with those particular preferences.
We're talking with Stephen Dinan from the Washington Times. While we have you, there was another Supreme Court decision today dealing with when businesses must accommodate the religious observances of their employees.
Yeah, so the court in the 1970s, there was a series of cases that looked at church-state relations and what the government could compel and what businesses needed to do to accommodate religious observances. And in 1977, there was a case with an airline employee who wanted to be off work on the Sabbath, and the airline said it's too much of a burden on us to work that out. And the Supreme Court at that point agreed with the airline and said, yeah, anything other than a de minimis, the smallest of burdens, if there's any burden at all, then the business does not have to accommodate somebody's religious needs. The court today went back on that and it was a 9-0 decision, which is important. Went back on that ruling and said, well, de minimis may not have actually meant that small a standard. In fact, a business needs to show that it would face a substantial burden before it can refuse a religiously based accommodation request. So religious observers got a bit of a reprieve from the court today, though how this plays out, it will be interesting to see exactly what that substantial burden standard means, how much a business needs to show that it would suffer if somebody wants to not work Sundays or Saturdays or whatever their Sabbath practice is, or they want to be able to wear a religious outfit or religious garb. Those are the sorts of cases that will sort of test the boundaries of today's ruling.
Stephen Dinan is Washington Times politics editor. His stories at WashingtonTimes.com. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And more reaction to the Supreme Court case striking down affirmative action in college and university admissions. Congresswoman Virginia Foxx, Republican from Virginia, chair of the Education and Workforce Committee, putting out a statement. Academia's ivory towers should not divide and promote preferences based on the color of one's skin. Post-secondary education has been plagued by affirmative action for far too long, and I'm pleased the Supreme Court has finally upheld the equal protection of students. Fairness and merit will finally receive the due deference they deserve. And from the Congressional Black Caucus Chair, Stephen Horsford, Democrat from Nevada, and members of the CBC, by delivering a decision on affirmative action so radical as to deny young people seeking an education equal opportunity in our education system, the Supreme Court has thrown into question its own legitimacy. Unfortunately, we have seen backlash to progress many times throughout our nation's history. During Reconstruction, we had a mere 12 years of black achievement in policy, politics, and arts and sciences and education that were followed by 70 years of state-sanctioned Jim Crow. We didn't stop fighting for equality then, and we won't stop now because too much is at stake to allow extremists to turn back the clock on progress. That statement from the CBC and the Black Caucus Chair, Congressman Stephen Horsford. Leaders of civil rights group holding a news conference on this decision today in Washington, including Maya Wiley, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
This is the time when we say President Joe Biden is right. He is right to say that this is not a normal court. He is right to say that we have ideals that we have not lived up to, and he is absolutely right to say that we can and we must continue to ensure that every single one of our children has the opportunity to get the education they deserve and, quite frankly, they have earned. And President Biden, in his press conference that we all watched together, demonstrated a knowledge and understanding of the admissions processes of both Harvard and the University of North Carolina that far outstrips the description that we saw and the understanding that the Supreme Court shared in its majority opinion. and that Ketanji Brown Jackson in her dissent is absolutely right. We are a society that wants a country where what we look like does not impede our opportunity, and we do not yet live in it. And that is why we are going to continue to fight together and unified, and not let those who try to pit our communities against one another to succeed.
Maya Wiley, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, at a news conference today with leaders of other civil rights organizations. Separate news conference had Calvin Yang, a member of the group Students for Fair Admissions, which brought the Supreme Court case. And Calvin Yang says he was denied admission to Harvard. He welcomed today's decision.
Today's decision has started a new chapter in the saga of the history of Asian Americans in this country. It marks the promise of a new beginning, a resurgence of the principles of the American dream, and a return to the egalitarian principles for all in this shining city on a hill. Many people have asked me why I chose to speak out publicly for affirmative action, especially amidst the potential backlash. My answer is simple. If no one is standing up to speak out against the injustices faced by our community, then our well-deserved rights will never be realized. Today's victory transcends far beyond those of us sitting in this room today. It belongs to thousands of sleepless high schoolers applying to colleges. It belongs to the overachieving son of a recently unemployed West Virginia coal miner. It belongs to those with the last names of Smith or Lee, Chen or Gonzalez. It belongs to all of us who deserved a chance, but can now rejoice over the fact that at least our kids can be judged based on their achievements and merits alone. Most importantly, it belongs to all of us who believe that if we work hard enough, we all can have a chance at getting our own slice of this grand American dream. I firmly believe that diversity is very important for education. The future leaders of America need to have representation across all backgrounds of the society. This is why, as I mentioned in my previous speech, affirmative action is a well-intentioned idea that is poorly executed in reality. Thus, it is my hope to see a renewed college admission system that recognizes and rewards the multifaceted talents and diverse perspective that each individual can bring to the table.
Calvin Yang is member of the group Students for Fair Admissions, which brought the Supreme Court case that was decided today. Calvin Yang says he applied to Harvard but did not get in, taking part in a Students for Fair Admissions news conference. House and Senate are not in session in Washington today, but many members of Congress are tweeting about this case. Don Bacon, Republican from Nebraska, writes, students should be able to pursue the best educational opportunities regardless of their race. Today, the Supreme Court ruled against the system that discriminates against Asian Americans. We need a fair admissions process that rewards the best and brightest students of all races. And a tweet from Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, Democrat from Massachusetts, affirmative action is meant to combat the legacy of anti-black racism and discrimination still present in higher education. This ruling will uphold white supremacy and exacerbate racial disparities. Universities must affirm their commitment to racial and ethnic diversity. C-SPAN covered the oral arguments of the Supreme Court cases. The cases were Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard and Students for Fair Admissions v. UNC back in October 2022. And you can find the audio, Supreme Court only allows audio, at our website, cspan.org. Total running time of the two cases, about 4.5 hours. This is Washington Today. A story from Yahoo Finance. The U.S. economy grew more than initially anticipated in the first quarter, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis at the Commerce Department. The third reading of gross domestic product showed the U.S. economy grew by 2% in the first quarter, marking a sharp increase from the previous reading of 1.3%. New data also out Thursday showed the early stages of an upward trend in weekly jobless claims, which could indicate softening in the labor market. hasn't materialized, with 239,000 claims in the week ending June 24th. Jobless claims hit their lowest levels since May. That from Yahoo Finance. The CEO of Bank of America, Brian Moynihan, talked about the economic outlook today at the City Club of Cleveland.
The Bank of America research team, run by Candace Browning-Platt, and is the best in the world, and they have continued to look at the situation, and they've basically been pretty consistent for about a year and a half that there will be a mild recession. The question is, when will it occur? And they've continuously pushed that out a little bit, and most recently they moved 2 quarters of recession, the first 2 quarters of next year, from the third, fourth, and first quarters, 3 quarters. So it's a mild recession. It happens a few quarters out, and that's been the thing is people keep predicting a few quarters out, and it just keeps pushing out. And that comes down to, we could talk about what you see in the data, what consumers are doing, employment levels are strong, and all those types.
Is there any possibility that there won't be a recession if we just keep pushing it out?
Well, the interesting question is, people ask what it will feel like, and you're saying it'll feel like inflation already makes consumers feel different. Higher interest rates make consumers feel different. But so the belief is, for the Fed, for the 2 things had to happen to get inflation under control. You had to raise interest rates, and you had to pull some of the money out of the system, and both are being accomplished. And they're having the impact that people want. So housing slows down, car purchases slow down, everything is very rate sensitive, moves quickly, and then it takes a little time to get through it. But the interesting thing is consumers are still spending. And so, but the rate of, if you look at our consumers, they spend about $4.5 trillion a year out on their check and debit cards, writing checks, cash out of the ATM they spend, et cetera, ACH, wire, Zelle, et cetera. That goes out a year. And if you looked at it from 21 to 22, it grew about 9.5%. And if you look at it year to date, it's 5-ish%. And if you look at it in the month of June so far, it's 4-ish%. And that is more consistent with where it was in 17, 18, 19, where you had higher interest rates, and they're slowing down the economy and taking monetary accommodation out, but you had low growth and low inflation. And so that consumer change in activity is a indicator that the effect of the rates, the effect of all the different factors is slowing down the economy. And that's very important, because that's the hard thing. The American consumer likes to spend money, travels, does a lot of good things. And when they're employed at the level of 3.7% unemployment, it's hard to slow them down, but they've slowed them down enough that I think that means inflation should get under control.
Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan at the City Club of Cleveland in Cleveland. He also talked about the Federal Reserve's annual stress tests of banks. A Reuters article explains, under the annual test established following the 2007 through 9 financial crisis, the Fed assesses how banks' balance sheets would fare against the hypothetical economic crash. It found the lenders would suffer a combined $541 billion in losses under the Fed's severe downturn scenario, one of its toughest yet, but would still have over twice the amount of capital required to absorb loan losses. That from the Reuters article. Back to Brian Moynihan.
We just got the stress test results for our industry yesterday. If you look at the
congratulations
credit losses,
on those, I was going to say.
But if you look at it, what that says for the 8 big banks, they have $900+ billion of capital. The losses, I think, are $130 billion. If you look at across the 30 banks, they say, there's not whatever 100 billion losses, but that's against multiples of that of capital. So it's a pretty impressive thing, because that scenario is basic unemployment going from where it is today up to 10+% overnight. Commercial real estate dropping immediately, home prices down 20-30% or something like that. These factors, bond prices dropping by 300 basis points, and stuff that are just wild. And yet the ability of the industry to withstand that is demonstrated by this testing. But the real ability to withstand it was demonstrated by the fact of where we are when you had the massive movement, huge monetary buildup, huge monetary takeout, interest rates rising fast, deposits moving out of the system fast on purpose. Its intended outcome, what the Fed's trying to do, is to shrink the size of the bank industry so it cannot lend as much, therefore not quite inflationary activity. All that took place. And you survived. Then you have this theoretical test, and it also shows. And you're sort of saying, that's a pretty good outcome.
Brian Moynihan is CEO of Bank of America, today at the City Club of Cleveland. On Wall Street, the Dow up 269, NASDAQ down a fraction, S&P up 19. Washington today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. Now to Russia and Ukraine. This from the New York Times. U.S. officials citing early intelligence reports say that Russian authorities appear to have detained a top general under suspicion that he was involved in or had knowledge of the planning for the Wagner Group's failed rebellion. Focus in Russia on the fate of the general, the country's former top commander in Ukraine, has been intense following a New York Times report that the U.S. spy agencies believe that he knew ahead of time about the rebellion led by Yevgeny Prigozhin against Russia's military leadership. A question about this today at the Pentagon briefing with the press secretary, Pat Ryder.
Just following up on the activities this weekend in Russia, what fallout has this building seen following the revolt, and do you have any indications that Putin has begun to purge his ranks? You know, we've seen the reports of General Sorokin being detained. What light can you shed on this?
Sure. As it relates to the security situation internal to Russia, obviously something that we continue to keep a close eye on. As it pertains to press reports involving the potential detainment of Russian military personnel, I don't have anything to provide from the podium on that. Certainly our focus is on ensuring that we don't see anything that would portend strategic instability. In other words, nothing to indicate that any concerns regarding Russian nuclear forces. We have not seen anything to this stage that concerns us, and certainly nothing that has required us to change our own force posture. So again, we'll continue to follow the situation there closely, but in the meantime, our focus remains on supporting Ukraine and its fight to defend itself.
Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder and Air Force Brigadier General with reporters today in the Pentagon briefing room. From the Guardian newspaper, Ukraine's defense minister has raised the stakes before the next NATO summit, saying he expects a guarantee that his country will be invited to join the military alliance at the conclusion of the war with Russia, describing membership as non-negotiable. Before the 33rd meeting of the alliance's leaders taking place in a fortnight in Vilnius, defense minister said that Kyiv recognized that accession to NATO was not possible while the conflict continued, but insisted hard pledges for the future would need to be made. That from The Guardian. Reporter asked the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg today about what pledge language will come out of the upcoming NATO summit.
As always, when we are going to make important decisions at summits in NATO, there is a process. There are consultations. This is the way NATO makes decisions. I'm confident that we will find a united way forward and find also a united way to address Ukraine's membership aspirations. I think we have to remember that all allies agree that NATO's door is open, that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance, and that it is for the NATO allies and Ukraine to decide when Ukraine should become a member, and Russia doesn't have a veto on NATO enlargement. The most urgent task is to ensure that Ukraine gets enough donations, military support, so President Putin doesn't win and Ukraine prevails as a sovereign independent nation, because without that there is no membership issue to be discussed at all. We will help Ukraine, we support Ukraine in moving forward and come closer to NATO, partly by expanding our practical cooperation, help them to be fully interoperable with NATO with this multi-year program for transition from Soviet era to NATO standards and procedures and equipment, and also by strengthening the political ties. We are looking into a way to establish a NATO-Ukraine Council. So I'm absolutely confident that when NATO leaders meet in Vilnius, we will send a strong message of support to Ukraine.
The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, during a joint news conference with the visiting Bulgarian Prime Minister. AFP reports that NATO countries have agreed to extend the mandate of Secretary Stoltenberg and will make a formal announcement next week, diplomats said Thursday. Multiple diplomats at NATO confirmed that its 31 member states had reached consensus to prolong the tenure of Jens Stoltenberg for another year after struggling to find a suitable replacement by the summit in Lithuania in 2 weeks. That from AFP. Jens Stoltenberg has been the Secretary General of NATO since 2014. Former U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has made a surprise visit to Ukraine, becoming the first Republican presidential candidate to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during the campaign season. Mike Pence spoke with NBC News while in Ukraine.
You're the first presidential candidate in this race to visit this country. For others who will inevitably be asked about this conflict, who will be talking about it on the campaign trail, what message do you want to convey to your peers in the Republican Party, to your peers on the campaign trail, about what you're witnessing here right now?
Oh, beyond the human loss and the heartbreak that we've seen from this unprovoked Russian invasion, my message to the American people is simply that it's vitally important that America continue to lead on the world stage. I mean, that we stand up to the kind of naked aggression that we've seen here. I truly do believe that by giving the Ukrainian military the resources that we have over the last year and a half to push back on this Russian invasion, that the West has really shown its strength. The American people have shown our commitment to freedom. Look, the war here in Ukraine is not our war, but freedom is our fight. And by standing with the courageous people of Ukraine, as they not only fight back but ultimately repel this Russian invasion, I think we're advancing not only the interest of freedom, but let me be clear, my other message is that we're advancing our national interest. I mean, the reality is that Russia, other than during the 4 years of our administration, Russia has attempted to redraw international lines by force. The antidote to that is American strength and American leadership on the world stage. And for my part, I'm going to continue to be a voice for that leadership because I truly do believe that by giving the Ukrainian military the resources they need to continue to drive back the Russian military to reclaim their sovereignty will not only send a message about unprovoked aggression in the world to the Russians, but will send a very clear message to countries like China as they contemplate their own military ambitions across the Asia Pacific. When the free world stands together, we can achieve peace in the world. And I believe, seeing what I've seen here today, I'm even more resolved than ever to be that voice for American leadership.
Republican presidential candidate and former Vice President Mike Pence today in Ukraine, an interview with NBC News. And an article accompanying that interview on the NBC News website has this: the future of U.S. support for the Ukrainian war effort is in question and the voters Mike Pence is trying to woo in the Republican primary aren't eager to aid the country. In the latest NBC News national poll, 52% of GOP primary voters said they would be less likely to back a candidate who supports sending more funding and weapons to Ukraine, while just 28% said they would be more likely. This is Washington Today. U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy says that if claims from IRS investigator Gary Shapley and other IRS whistleblowers are true, they're claiming the U.S. attorney investigating Hunter Biden was blocked from bringing charges outside of Delaware and did not have full control of the case. And it goes against statements from Attorney General Merrick Garland. Then Speaker McCarthy says the U.S. House will begin an impeachment inquiry against the Attorney General. Speaker McCarthy was interviewed on Fox News Wednesday night.
If, in fact, Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, lied and that Mr. Weiss said what he said, and we have 6 people sending contemporaneous notes would prove that, in fact, Weiss said this, that he did not have the authority that the Attorney General testified to under oath before Congress. Is that perjury, sir?
Well, it's lying to Congress, yes. And that, what I said earlier, someone has lied here. If we find that Garland has lied to Congress, we will start impeachment inquiry. But you have to understand what we found out. First of all, I've got to thank these three chairmen. What Jim Jordan, what Comer has done, what Jason Smith has done, we wouldn't know any of this if we didn't win the majority. We would not know any of this if we didn't start the weaponization committee that Jim Jordan runs over.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, on Fox News Wednesday night. From CBS News, House Republicans are asking the Justice Department to make available for interviews 11 federal officials, including U.S. Attorney David Weiss, in connection with the decision earlier this month to charge Hunter Biden with tax and gun violations, according to a letter Thursday from the chairs of the House Judiciary, Oversight, and Ways and Means Committees that was obtained by CBS News. The request to conduct the interviews comes after two IRS agents came forward alleging the investigation into President Joe Biden's son was given special treatment. That from CBS News. Dr. Rachel Levine is Assistant Health and Human Services Secretary for Health. She was interviewed today about health equity by Washington Post Associate Editor Jonathan Capehart. Part of the conversation was about Pride Month and transgender rights.
You're the highest ranking out transgender government official in U.S. history. You and I were both at Vice President Harris's Pride Month reception at the Vice President's residence last night. And in her remarks, she decried the 500 plus bills that have been introduced in legislatures across the country. More than 70 of them have become law. There have been challenges, to be sure. Just yesterday, federal judges in Kentucky and Tennessee, they blocked bans on gender-affirming care for minors in those states. I would love your thoughts on the impact of these bills and laws popping up across the country.
Well, it is very challenging for health equity for the LGBTQI+ community. And these politically and ideologically motivated laws and actions are harming youth, particularly transgender youth, their families, and even their providers who are under siege in many parts of this country. And they're really interfering with the relationship between expert physicians, for instance, at children's hospitals, these young people and their families. And it's not where government belongs.
Personally, excuse me, as an out transgender person, I'm not going to say as government official, though I don't want to get you in trouble, but personally, what do you make of the tenor and tone of the conversation that we're having in this country when it comes to LGBTQIA+ issues?
Well, you know, again, the challenge has been these regressive laws and actions that have been promulgated throughout the country. Again, being done specifically for political and ideological purposes. But I see a change. I think things are changing. I think that since Transgender Day of Visibility and now the momentum we've developed at Pride, I think that the conversation is changing. I think the narrative is changing, focusing on these vulnerable youth and their families and their doctors. And I think with Pride Month, just finishing up this week, that we are going to continue to change that narrative and continue to make progress. That's why I've said this should be a summer of Pride. We should have Pride all summer, which means that we need to continue these discussions. We need to continue to change the narrative about health equity and about families and about these young people so that we can get past this very challenging stage and continue the progress that we have been making before.
And in your travels around the country, is that what's driving this optimism from you about a summer of Pride, that there is pushback around the country to the overall rhetoric and tone and tenor of the conversation?
Right. That's exactly right. So at the same time, I see these young people and their families, and I meet their doctors who are having such struggles, but I sense a change. I sense a positive change that I think is going to continue, despite the challenges that we face, and I think that that's going to lead for the tide to turn. And I think that these laws and actions will not stand, and I think that we will continue to make progress. Now, I'm a positive and optimistic person because I choose to be positive and optimistic. But under the Biden-Harris administration and the leadership shown at the highest levels of government and across the administration for the LGBTQI+ community and the actions in states and in communities, changing hearts and minds, I remain positive.
Dr. Rachel Levine, Assistant Health and Human Services Secretary for Health, interviewed by Washington Post Associate Editor Jonathan Capehart. New York Times reported this week that transgender people in Denmark have a significantly higher risk of suicide than other groups, according to an exhaustive analysis of health and legal records from nearly 7 million people over the last 4 decades. The study is the first in the world to analyze national suicide data for this group. That from the New York Times. The findings were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about emailed to you every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.